I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as traditional owners of the land on which we meet this evening. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. My name is Chris Mackey and I'm Professor of Classics and Public Scholarship at La Trobe University. And it's with great pleasure that I welcome you to tonight's panel discussion focusing on the drinking habits of Australians and alcohol consumption in a broader sense. The negative impact of excessive alcohol consumption is often remarked upon with regard to public health outcomes, domestic and civic violence, and road trauma, among many other negative effects. Research is also telling us that some of us are drinking less, not just in Australia, but around the world. Surprisingly, it's young people who are drinking less alcohol, while their parents continue to enjoy drinks at home on a regular basis. Baby boomers, like me, have become a new at-risk group, but is this label justified? Have young people given up one drug for another, and is the generational divide real? To explore these issues and many more, we've invited a specialist panel of commentators and policy experts to consider the social impact of alcohol and the current trends in the consumption of it. So I'll introduce our panel starting from George here and work our way down. So first on the panel we're joined by George Megalogenis, an author and journalist with 3 decades experience in the media. George is a highly engaging commentator who deals with big picture social trends. His book, The Australian Moment, won the 2013 Prime Minister's Literary Award for non-fiction and the 2012 Walkley Award for non-fiction, and formed the basis for his ABC documentary series, Making Australia Great. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice, I've got a bit of that lurgy going around. Joining him is Gay Alcorn, the Melbourne editor of the Guardian Australia. Gay was editor of the Sunday Age for 4 years until 2012, before joining the Guardian, where she writes on culture and politics and is a regular columnist. She's won 3 Walkley Awards and a Quill Award for Best Commentary in 2018. Gay recently wrote an important article about taking a break from booze, which resonated with her many readers. We're going to talk about that tonight. Our third panellist is La Trobe's Sarah Callinan, who has made significant contributions to alcohol research both in Australia and internationally. As a researcher at the university's Centre for Alcohol Policy Research, Sarah is interested in alcohol consumption in the home, in the drinking habits of older people, and screening tools that identify harmful drinking. She works on multiple internationally collaborative research grants and is a regular in print, radio and online, including The Conversation. And I checked before I came that the article she wrote, she's written on The Conversation, has 528,000 readers, which is a pretty amazing effort, especially for a classicist that gets just a few. We're also joined by ABC journalist Flip Pryor, who previously trained journalists and politicians as part of her role at Twitter Australia. She's also worked at the Walkley Foundation for Journalism late last year, partly as a dare and partly out of curiosity. Flip decided to quit the bottle once and for all and write about the experience of becoming a non-drinker for the ABC. Things one does for the ABC. In her downtime, Flip sings and performs in 2 a cappella groups. Don't think we'll get to talk about those today. Completing our panel tonight is Dr. Michael Livingston, one of Australia's leading alcohol policy researchers based at La Trobe University. He has a strong track record in publications and grants and is committed to translating research into real policies. Michael leads the quantitative research group within the university, and his work examines trends and patterns in alcohol consumption, as well as the impact of alcohol policies on reducing harm. I'll hand over now to our very experienced and wonderful broadcaster, journalist, tonight's host, Francis Leach, to lead our panel discussion. So please welcome our panel.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you all for being here tonight for this latest Bold Thinking series events, which is being recorded by the ABC for its Big Ideas program, which we broadcast at a later date. It's also being live streamed via the La Trobe Uni website as well. So we look forward to an hour of conversation on the stage, then half an hour of questions from you as well on this topic. To get started, to know where we are, we have to understand where we've been and where we've come from. And George, I would proffer to you that Australia has, in many ways, for generations, identified itself for its capacity to hold its drink. In fact, in many ways, being a good Aussie was being able to have a beer and to be able to drink. Has that changed? Changing. I'll come back to you on that question. We'll get you mic'd up, and so that you can respond to it and make sure that we get that captured. But I want to talk along the panel about it. Gay, do you think Australian identity has changed in relation to its ability to judge a person's character on the basis of whether they drink or not? Even though the use of the phrase "wowser" is a pejorative about your character if you don't drink.
Yes, I think my instinct is, and I'm very wary of kind of thinking what I'm thinking is what everyone's thinking. My instinct is there is a little bit of a shift going on. I mean, throughout history, going back to the Greeks and beforehand, there's always been this dichotomy of drinking is a great deal of pleasure, but it also has harms, and there's been this balance back and forth about where the state should push in. But there's also been this dichotomy of, that it's a muse. People's warriors speak the truth when they're drinking. Great poets have talked about the wonder of alcohol, and then there's been this other side of it but the drunkard. Dickens wrote about the drunkard who ruins his whole family. So it's always been there. My guess is that alcohol kind of won that debate after Prohibition, and certainly in Australia it did. But I just feel there's a little bit of a shift, perhaps because of the wellness movement, or the people are more interested in health, much more knowledge about what the influence of alcohol does to your brain, that people are starting to think about it a little bit differently than they did. But that's my instinct more than factual.
But to get back to the original premise, George, our identity was based around beer, or drinking, I should say. I mean, the Bob Hawke mythology is all about being able to scull a yard glass. I mean, he's famous for being Prime Minister of Australia, obviously. He's just as famous for being the record holder at Oxford Uni for sculling beer. I mean, we took as much pride in that as we did as his achievements in office.
And in fact, that's what a lot of people remembered Bob for. And in fact, after that 8 years that he was Prime Minister, he dried out to become Prime Minister because he didn't want to embarrass his country, because when he drank to excess. In fact, the interesting thing about him, when he was ACTU President and industrial disputation in Australia peaks around the same time he's ACTU President, as does beer consumption per head. So it's basically the Hawke decade of the 70s is sort of built in and around his personality, and the culture seemed to permit him as a public figure in the 70s being a larrikin and a heavy drinker. But he decides that he can't lead a nation any other way but stone cold sober, which he does. But then again, after he leaves, he gets back on it again. Very, very small anecdote. When we were filming Making Australia Great, interviewed him in the morning. It was a very intense 2-hour conversation, and as soon as we finished, around midday, invites me into the office, and there's a beautiful bottle of red wine there, no food. We knocked the thing back in about half an hour, check the views, and he says, "I think I've got the best views of all the former Prime Ministers. Do you reckon?" But I just think when you think about it in terms of the personification of a particular way of doing it, he's predicting the other thing as well, which is having to smarten up. Because what's the 80s about? The 80s is about working harder, giving up the long lunch, deregulated economy, intense hours at the office, and then being contacted after the office once the mobile phone gets into your hand. I think life has just become a bit more pressured in Australia, and we'll explore it, but I think that's one of the reasons why the culture has done a backflip on it.
And I guess also the demographics are changing too. If it was probably predominantly Anglo-Celtic culture where drinking was central, we might be seeing a cultural shift that sees a different approach to alcohol being incorporated from different cultures which are now making up the fabric of the Australian society.
Yeah, I mean, whenever we sort of look at how much people are drinking, if we ever sort of split the sample into, people who were born in Australia or people who were born elsewhere, the people who were born elsewhere tend to drink a lot less than the people who were born in Australia. However, in terms of youth drinking trends and how much that's decreasing, even if you take that out, I'm pretty sure, Michael, you still find that young people are drinking significantly less.
So, Michael, your research is on young people and their drinking habits, and there's a lot of moral panic about the welfare of young people and their relationship with drugs, both illicit and otherwise. Is alcohol still the biggest problem for young people?
Yeah, it still is the number one drug for teenagers and young adults, but it's a lot less prominent than it was 15 or 20 years ago. It's come down. If you look at 16-year-olds, I'm going to feedback as well now. If you look at 16-year-olds, in 2001, maybe 3/4 of them were drinkers, and in 2016, it's about a third. It's dropped by more than half, at least if you believe surveys, which is a whole other conversation. But it seems to be matching most of the data that we have from other sources as well. So it's a real shift, but it hasn't been replaced by huge uptakes in cannabis or ice or illicit drugs. It's really, those are going down as well in these groups. So it's a big change.
So what are some of the theories around why kids are deciding to drink less? Because it's obviously a choice they're making to not drink as much as maybe their parents did at that age.
Yeah, I mean, it's interestingly, it's not just an Australian story. So this is something that happens in a bunch of countries at about the same time. And we have so many theories which are all very hard to test. We know that parenting is changing, that parents are much more aware of the risks of drinking, and that might not always change their behaviour, but it changes how they treat their kids, whether they'll buy them alcohol, whether they'll permit them to go to parties where there's alcohol. We know that the internet kind of explodes in the early 2000s, and we were just talking beforehand about the things in our youths that are not captured for posterity on Instagram or Facebook, whereas 17-year-olds now know that if they do something ridiculous, it's going to be photographed, shared. You know, there's kind of uncertainty about that, I think, as well. And there's pressures. I think that young adulthood is a more high-pressured time now than it was earlier, and so people are more worried about making sure they tick off all the boxes, achieve all the things they want to achieve, and alcohol can get in the way of that a little bit.
Flip, when you hear that about young people making those sorts of choices, would you have made those choices when you were growing up?
I don't know. No, I mean, yeah, I don't know actually. I think, you know, I was a teenage boozer. I mean, I was into my parents' liquor cabinet from a really young age. I remember they tried to trick me, and they put little bits of cardboard in there, and I really delighted in being able to get past them to make my rocket fuel. I found it really an adventurous thing to do, and I kind of wasn't really worried about the consequences at that age at all.
So you've come full circle in a way, because you started writing your blog about deciding to give up alcohol.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about how you got to the point where that decision was made.
I'd actually thought about it for quite a while. I was really sick of hangovers. I felt like I was stuck in a cycle of kind of every Saturday waking up feeling like crap and thinking, oh God, why? You know, Friday night drinks is a really ingrained part of our culture. I've come up through, you know, the journalism is where I earn my stripes, and I'm sure my fellow journalists will agree. It's a very well-known industry to be a heavy drinking industry, and I was an enthusiastic participant for many years, and I just got in bad habits, really. And I started to think about the fact that, because I started drinking really young, and I thought I hadn't had an entire year in my adult life where I hadn't had no alcohol, and I thought, oh, that seems really bad. And then I started to wonder, because it's so ingrained in society, could I actually give it up? And it became more like a personal challenge than anything else to see if I could do it. Because so many people said, you can't do that. You can't give up drinking for a year. You'll you know, lose your social life. You'll stop having fun. Look around, it's everywhere. And it's funny, when you stop, you start to notice how everywhere alcohol is.
And Gay, this mirrors your own experience, doesn't it, in that now famous column that you wrote about your relationship to drinking, and very honest exploration of your own relationship with drinking and what you were going to do about it. Give us a sense of why you wrote the article, and more, it's extraordinary, the response to it that you got.
I'm a bit older than Flip, but I think for my generation, I mean, my mother, who's in her 80s, in her era, kind of good girls didn't drink really. Nice girls didn't drink, it was the blokes who drank. So the cultural drinking was a male thing. But in my generation, just as the feminism got going, drinking was about emancipation. We wanted to get as drunk as the blokes. It was a bit like sex, really. It was a symbol of feminism in a way. So we all drank as much as the men and wanted to get drunk. But my drinking, I think, was fairly normal. It didn't seem to worry me all that much. It wasn't something I thought about a lot, except for a few years ago I started to think, I'm actually drinking more than I feel comfortable with. It started to have its negative impacts seemed to be a bit more than my enjoyment of it, and I sort of thought, this has become an issue. I didn't like feeling, you know, one drink became 2 drinks in the evening, became 3 drinks, and, you know, more than once a week it was a bottle or more, and I thought, oh, this is something wrong. So I just decided to take a month off, nothing like Flip, and I wrote a column about it at the end of July, and it was read by, you know, 1 million people, which, I mean, you can work for weeks and weeks on a story and it's read by a few thousand, but, you know, 1 million people is extraordinary.
All over the world too.
Wow. Yes, I mean, actually very big readership in the UK. And I guess the theme of my piece was, look, I just decided to give up for a month, but this was much better than I thought it would be. So I thought, this will be a challenge and I may not be able to do this, but I did feel so much better physically, but also mentally. I was a bit more present for people, didn't feel like I was sort of as judgmental, certainly slept better, all of those things, felt like I was better at work. And I sort of said, what a bummer. I really enjoy work, but look, now that I see the benefits of even having a month off, it's a dilemma for me to not to do it. And the response was a lot of people, some quite prominent people in Australia, contacted me and said, I have the same problem. I don't feel like I'm an alcoholic, but I'm noticing I'm drinking a lot more, particularly middle-aged women like I am, and saying I'm drinking more than I want to. I've got to do something about this. One woman said, you've colonised my mind. This is exactly how I feel about alcohol. So I was blown away by the response, actually.
Sarah, Gay's experience, does that mirror your research about drinking in the home and the domestication of drinking? If drinking previously was a collective experience and a social experience in pubs, at sporting events, and a lubricant for those social occasions, people are doing it more in their homes and therefore maybe aren't as aware of the impact or the creep of their drinking into the fabric of their lives and the level of it. Is that what you're seeing in your research?
Yeah, we asked just over 2,000 Australians about where they drink their alcohol, and we found that 63% of all alcohol in Australia, so nearly 2/3, is consumed in the drinker's own home. So that doesn't count alcohol that is consumed, in other people's homes. That's another 13%. And so it certainly is. I think, especially since drink driving laws came in the 70s. Alcohol consumption's become a lot less about being in a bar, but I think one of the problems is that when we think about who risky drinkers are and who gets harmed by consumption, we like to just think about young people getting drunk in the pub, and we're not thinking enough about the sort of long-term harms that can come out of just more regular drinking in the home.
If middle-aged women are becoming an at-risk group, and we heard from Chris about the numbers of baby boomers that are, drinking has always predominantly, George, been associated with masculinity, hasn't it? So how much of a surprise is it to know now that it isn't just, it isn't a binary gender choice?
Yeah, so where do I begin with my surprises?
Yeah.
The interesting to Michael and Sarah is the step down in consumption for young people, and the culture has obviously changed. But the permission that the culture gave people of Gay's generation to join the men drinking, I keep thinking back to. I always cross-reference They're a Weird Mob for some of this stuff, because there's a beautiful scene where Nina Carlotta goes into a bar and the other guy is explaining to him that you have to shout. I don't know if any of you remember that scene, but there are no women in that bar. And one of the big sort of emancipation sort of gestures was women going from the ladies' lounge into the front bar and to be able to drink at that point. And that's the 60s, right? That's the 60s crossing over into the 70s. And I'm surprised that young people have a completely different take on drinking. So the smoking thing has taken us many, many generations to sort of not just counter the propaganda from big tobacco, but for it to then become socially not permissible to smoke. So in a sense, smokers get exiled to the outside space, and even then, outside they're getting herded off into back lanes and sort of the windswept parts of office blocks and even Parliament House. Parliament House is one of the saddest things you'll see if you're ever in the press gallery looking out. The 2 or 3 chain smokers out in the courtyard. I'm more interested in what's happening to the baby boomers now and how long it's going to take for the penny to drop for them. Whilst we've got a couple of sort of now nonconformists. Is that how we describe you? You're now nonconformist because you've switched.
I'm not quite a baby boomer, I don't think.
No, you're not quite a baby boomer either.
So I thought you were talking to someone else.
Yeah. But if their consumption's tracking up though, this is the big surprise.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk to Sarah. This is your area of expertise. What are you finding when it comes to the reasons why that this trend is occurring? Because I guess the presumption is the older you get, the wiser you get. You understand the impact of alcohol and the consequences of overindulging. You'd be inclined to drink less, but this is not the case, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's probably worth pointing out that we don't really know for sure that they're drinking more, but we certainly know that they're failing to decline in the same way as younger drinkers are. But there certainly does seem to be some evidence in particular around risky drinking occasions that they might be ticking up a little bit.
So when you say risky drinking, what are we talking about? Let's define our term.
I know that I've seen some stuff done on. It was defined in two very different ways. One was 5 standard drinks in a drinking occasion, and one was 20 standard drinks in a drinking occasion. And if you do want to see who's drinking 20 plus standard drinks in a drinking occasion, that is still much more likely to be a young person than an older person. It's just that they're declining, and the older population is either staying steady or possibly ticking up a little bit. As to why, it might be that it's a generation that's had a lot going for them economically and in terms of access to healthcare and so on. So they might just be healthy enough to continue on. And so it might be that often people get a health scare, and that's what leads to them decreasing their drinking. But if you're not getting those health scares, you can just keep on keeping on. So yeah, it might be that.
Can I say something about that? Just the feedback I got from my piece anyway was that a couple of groups, particularly women, so men might be different, but women working really hard, pressures of life, women working really hard, they've got kids, they have to come home to do the second shift. Having that drink at sort of 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock can be the one relaxing moment of their life. And I think even for slightly older women too, and maybe men too, it is the sandwich generation of trying to, they're working longer hours, they're on all the time, their parents may be ill and they're caring for them also, they've still got dependent children. I do think pressures of life, because also it is an addictive substance. So after a period of time, I thought, I might be addicted to this, but I had no idea really that I was ever going to actually get a physical addiction. And so it may take some time for that to fall through. But certainly what came to me in the response was the pressure of life. And it does seem to be something, falsely or not, that will relax them and take that away.
And Flip, can I ask you about that? In your decision to take on this dry year as you have, was that something that you noticed once you become a non-drinker and you look from the outside into a culture where drinking is presumed and it's central? So every social function you go to, predominantly, alcohol will be available. You can either buy it if you're at a dinner where you're paid to go in, it'll be available for you to drink. So everywhere you go, you have a choice. You have to choose either to or not to in most social settings.
You do. And it's kind of the opposite of smoking in a way, because when you choose not to drink, you are the ostracised one.
Yep.
Or people, I mean, it's been almost 10 months now, and people want to talk about it endlessly. They're fascinated by the fact that I don't drink now.
The sober curious.
The sober curious, yeah. Because they usually say, are you doing that? Oh, I could never do that. That's the first thing they say. And it's really interesting.
What do they mean, do you think they could never do?
The very idea of not drinking at all is just an impossible thought for people to comprehend, because so many people rely on it as a social crutch. If you go to an event where the booze is free, it feels rude not to take a drink. I go to lots of events where there's a free bar, and I've had to learn to go to the mineral water first. And the old me kind of thinks, free drinks, I want to have some of those because they're free. And I'm surrounded by it, and weddings, funerals, christenings, any occasion.
So
any occasion.
Now that you're outside that bubble, are you
Yeah.
shocked at how central drinking is to most of our cultural exchange?
Yeah, because you don't notice, and it's so normalised and so condoned. And I've written a bit about the fact that sometimes I would go to work and I'd be a bit hungover and I feel a bit guilty and sort of scuttle into work. But if you were out with colleagues, everyone would be kind of like, this is really, everyone's a bit hungover today, and it's so socially acceptable. And to not do it just puts you apart, basically, from the pack. And it's a really interesting, and it's been weird for me because I've been a drinker my whole life, my whole adult life, and to suddenly be the person who's on the outer is a really weird feeling. And I think you have to have quite a strong sense of self to be able to walk into a bar where everyone else is drinking and you're not, and you still have to socialise with people or network with people. It's hard.
Has it realigned your relationship with some people who might feel threatened or judged by the fact that you've chosen not to drink?
I've found people I've tried giving up for periods before, just shorter periods, and I found people were a bit weird sometimes about it. I find that sometimes people get a bit defensive without you even saying a single word about their own drinking habits. I think you, in opting out, saying, no, I don't think this is healthy for me anymore, you're holding up a mirror to someone, whether you like it or not, and they don't like it. Because for someone like me, they might look at me and go, you don't have a problem, so why are you stopping? You don't need to stop. You don't have a problem. You're just like me. And I kind of think, that's interesting. You sort of touch a nerve without even meaning to sometimes.
And I wonder, Gay, from your experience as well, does it show that we have this sort of binary relationship to alcohol? You're either an okay drinker or you're an alcoholic, and there's nothing in between. You know, you're either okay with the booze or you've got a problem. But surely there's a spectrum there. And from the responses you received to your writing, did you discover that?
Yeah, no, look, I think you're right, and I think that's changing. I mean, a generation ago, I think that was right. You're an alcoholic, and perhaps you went to AA, or you're a normal drinker, and you didn't really have you didn't have a problem. You're just a normal drinker. But what's happened, and I think particularly through the internet and all these online forums about alcohol now, and I signed up to a thing called This Naked Mind 30 Days Experiment. Not to drink, and Annie Grace is just one of so many people now online. We're sort of everyday kind of people who are holding down jobs. They're not, on the corner with a brown paper bag or anything. They've got kids. Some of them have got high-powered jobs. They think I've got a problem with drinking, but I don't feel like I need to go to AA necessarily. So I think that's shifting, that sort of binary, like you're normal or you're an alcoholic. And in fact, alcoholic isn't a word that's really used that much anymore. It's out of style. But people are thinking it might be a little bit of a problem or it might be a big problem, but I'm a normal person with a problem with alcohol rather than I'm an alcoholic and needs to go to AA. There's been a shift there, I think. And it's because of this incredible online sharing of information, sharing their stories, giving advice, giving tips. It's a good thing about the internet and social media, I think.
Are there little tribes gathering online, little support groups?
Yes. I do find it a bit amusing.
Tell us about a few of their sort of support groups, little tribes that have sprung up.
Overall, I think they're wonderful and very supportive, and they're of each other and whatever their experience is. There is this sort of part of some of the people who are really into it see it as a sort of radical movement that sort of that it's transformative to our culture.
They're challenging the dominant paradigm, one glass of sparkling water at a time, are they?
Yes, and there's this whole language, kind of quit lit, which I'd never heard of, and sober curious, which I'd never heard of. They use these anagrams and things and so it's very earnest. But they also just support each other through, some quite hard times, I think. Flip, what do you think? It's a good little world, I reckon, out there, mostly.
Yeah, and it's a very active world.
Very.
And there's a lot of women in there, interestingly, in those groups. And, the groups are very, very supportive and very active, and they're just talking to each other constantly. And some people will pop in and say, I've had a really bad day, I really need a drink. And then they'll just get mobbed with people from all over the world saying, you can do it.
Yes.
And
or I've had a data point. They don't say I went on the booze last night. They say it's a data point, which means you have to analyse it and think about it, but don't call it a failure. It's a data point if you actually do
log
drink. Well, you can talk
on your
about
own spreadsheet.
It's a data point. How many data points have you had this month?
Blips.
Yes.
At some point, George, I reckon the grog economy is going to see this as a threat to its dominance, its centuries-long dominance in this country.
I've actually been thinking about this. So, the grog economy, we divide it in the sort of high end of it, which is the export earner, the wine sector, which has always been able to get a carve out. So when the GST, unfortunately I got too much corporate memory on the GST because I covered all the GST debates through the late 80s and especially in the 90s. And everybody asked for a carve out, but only 2 or 3 sectors could get them. And alcohol was one of the ones that needed to get it because there was a complication with state taxes. And the winemakers, because they could always convince the National Party and then always convince the sophisticates in the opinion-leading part of the marketplace, that this was a healthy thing to do. This is also going to reduce the current account deficit because it's a big export earner. But something has switched in the last 10 or so years. So if you think about the sectors that can basically ask a government and a people to do something not in their interests, obviously the miners are pretty good at that. I don't think the tobacco industry, it's about 20 or 30 years since the tobacco industry could actually bend, and in fact they get the life taxed out of them now. Every time that there's a gap in the budget, they'll go tobacco tax first. And it used to be beer cigs up, but if the beer went up, that could cost you an election, so you wouldn't push the beer up. But I think you can do it on alcohol as well now. I think there's almost, you're almost at that political permission point to be able to do it. And that's how I would measure these things. Whether somebody could go up to a government and say, okay, the evidence says we need to do something, but we don't want you to do it because we could blow your brains out if you try.
But I've been
mining tax, for example, is the best counterfactual you've got going around today. Everybody wanted one. The evidence said you should do it, but a couple of mining companies said, we'll get rid of the Prime Minister if you persist.
I've been fascinating though, George, about watching the Sydney lockout law debate,
Yeah.
and all the figures show, and I sort of wrote them down, that having those lockout laws reduced non-domestic related violence by hugely,
Yes,
more than 50%.
yes.
But I just think that the alcohol industry there has played a real role in the government now trying to get rid of those laws, but also just the cultural thing that public health are against, that even though the figures are very clear in St Vincent hospitals and others saying, you know, violence is clearly related to alcohol, the people in Sydney saying, oh, well, we have to have a drink any time we like. There's this real cultural thing going on there, but the industry has played a role, I think.
So the big thing in New South Wales are the pubs and the clubs,
Yeah.
which have not the alcohol makers, not the wine growers and not the beer makers and not the spirit makers. The pubs and the clubs themselves have leverage at a state political level, not at a national level. In fact, in a weird way, that debate hasn't even been had yet because they should be taxable entities, but they're not taxable entities. The ATO has been wanting to get into them for years, but no federal government will touch it because it's state level regulation. But they've clearly been able to paint a picture of, firstly, Mike Baird and Gladys Berejiklian as sort of killjoys.
It's affecting the Sydney economy also.
Yes, it's
That's
sort
what
of.
I say.
I do remember a couple of Sydney Writers' Festivals ago, everybody looking for someone to go at about 8 or 9 o'clock and being told you couldn't go into a pub, which was very, very interesting. But here's another way to think about it. The prohibition state in the early part of the 20th century and the temperance movement, especially in the late 19th century, is Victoria, not New South Wales, right? New South Wales traditionally is associated with that sort of, higher share of convicts, a lot more corruption at that sort of colonial and state government level. But when I see Sydney putting a tram line back up George Street and then the lockout laws, they've wanted to be Melbourne, but they've taken a time tunnel and they want to be Melbourne like in the 20s or the 30s rather than Melbourne today, which is probably a bit more relaxed about these things.
So, Michael, George has made a really good point and illustrated the power of government policy with the lockout laws, and Gay pointed to the fact that you can actually show a correlation between the reduction in violence and the power of those laws. What are we seeing about government's ability to frame policy around youth drinking, and has there been an effective nationwide approach to those sorts of laws and campaigns that have changed the way that kids approach alcohol?
It's a good question, and I think a lot of various agencies have wanted to claim credit for this great decline in youth drinking because it's quite striking, and it's the kind of thing we've been trying to do for decades. But nothing really stacks up because the campaigns that we run are very different to the campaigns that ran in Sweden or that ran in the UK, and their figures look almost exactly the same. We do know more broadly what works in alcohol policy. We know that increasing the price, boring things, increasing the price, shutting the pubs earlier, opening less bottle shops, makes a difference to harm. Governments are still very wary about any of those things, despite the fact that there is good evidence that attitudes are shifting, that people are a bit more supportive than they used to be. They're more aware of the risks of drinking than they used to be. But the industry maintains fairly high levels of influence, I think, at all levels of government, despite perhaps it being not at the level it was in the 80s or 90s.
Yeah. So, Michael, remind me of the Alco Pops. How did that go?
Yeah, that was a very kind of sudden move from the Labor government as part of their big preventative health agenda. It did reduce Alco-Pops consumption dramatically, and it was offset partly by other beverages. So it was actually, it's like the lockout laws, it's framed as an ineffective policy, a policy that failed. If you look at the data, it probably worked, but the narrative was pushed out very quickly that kids had shifted from Alco-Pops to straight spirits, that there was this huge boom in other kinds of drinking, and it was all a bit of a myth. There was certainly some shifting, but not a full amount. So it's another kind of example, I guess, of how the narrative around policy can be reframed quite quickly and the argument almost lost even when the policy works.
Yeah, especially the zero run-up. It was just announced out of the blue.
Yeah.
Would a policy change or policy shift be required to change the habits of older Australians who seem to be not taking on board the wider cultural shift to less drinking?
I think that the thing you'd really want to look at is price. In particular, you could look at, in Australia we've got a weird system where wine is taxed differently to beer and spirits. So beer and spirits are taxed based on the alcohol content, but wine is taxed on the price. And that is why you can buy cask wine at about 40 cents a standard drink, which is just astonishingly cheap. And so I think a change to that, a change where you either got rid of that sort of taxing structure for wine, or alternatively you put in a minimum price that alcohol could be sold at, given that older drinkers drink mainly in the home, that would be the best way of coming at drinking in older generations.
And I'm wondering, Gay, if a government really wanted to take this on at a federal level or even a state level, with so much revenue generated by the sale of alcohol, is it a self-defeating project for any brave government that wants to reduce the level of consumption significantly? Is it the alcohol industrial complex one that governments are addicted to themselves?
Well, it all should be pointed out that they donate millions of dollars to the major political parties, which I don't think is irrelevant either. I'm kind of a little wary, and excuse me for this, I might be wrong, but I kind of wonder whether or not we we want to reduce our alcohol. We're getting there anyway. Our alcohol is reducing with the policies we have now. I'm not saying price is not a big issue, it is, but I just do think public health has got to be careful that it isn't too moralistic, that it isn't, because for most people, is my understanding, they do drink within the national guidelines. It's only about 25-30% who drink over the national guidelines,
That's
which
a
is about 2
significant
drinks
number,
a
though.
week. Oh, it is, no doubt about it is. But I think for a lot of people, it's actually quite an enjoyable thing at fairly low risk. The new evidence that's coming out, of course, is that even moderate drinking is of a high risk. I mean, I went to my doctor recently because there was a report about HRT, and I'm on HRT, and that it increased your risk of breast cancer from 6.3 to 8.3% if you were over 50 in the next 20 years. And I said, oh, sorry, worried about this. And she said, well, yes, but it's got a lot of benefits. But it says it's not, alcohol increases the risk of your breast cancer far more than that. And we rarely hear about that. It's not front page news at all. So we're knowing more about the health risk. But I just think perhaps culturally we'll reduce anyway, but maybe I'm wrong and you have to put the price up.
I mean, I suppose one thing just quickly to that is that, so it is about sort of, let's say 25-30% of people who are drinking in a way that could cause them harm. But that's why I think it's really important to look at policies that that are sort of attached to each drink rather than each drinker, because I think it was how much of the consumption is how much of the alcohol is consumed by the top 10% of people?
The top 10% drink about 40% of all the alcohol, I think. So the heavy drinkers, most of the industry's money comes from the heavy drinkers.
Yes.
So it's a progressive tax system.
In some senses, it's progressive, and certainly in a health sense.
It's
and
progressive
in
an actual sense and a health sense.
Yeah. So the advantage of going for something like price is that the more you buy, the more that you would be affected. And if you are drinking sort of less than those 14 standard drinks a week that is recommended to avoid harm, that you would be less affected by any kind of policy, whilst a policy that was sort of attached to every single possible drinker, I think would then be, attaching itself much more to drinkers who are drinking in a way that is less likely to lead to harm.
It's a good... Sorry.
Those of us who... Hands up here who actually likes a drink still. I'm glad to see that we're amongst fellow drinkers and we can talk about this. For those of us who still like to have a drink, there has to be a place where we can feel like the culture in which we drink is a self-regulating, responsible one, where we don't need government to tell us how much to drink and don't need government to put the price up of our drinks because they're worried that we can't handle our grog. Is that unfair, Flip, that we should feel that as adults we're fully informed in this day and age about the health consequences of drinking? We like a couple of drinks. Why do we need the nanny state to determine for us what we drink and when?
I would argue, controversially, I don't think we are fully across the health effects of drinking. I think that lots of people probably think they drink to within safe levels, but they probably don't, because I don't know about you, but a free pour for me looks like that. A serving looks more like that, I think. And I think what I was quite shocked by was how there is very strong links between alcohol and all kinds of cancers that you'd be well aware of. And we don't have those conversations, and we don't think about it in the same way. So, you smoke now, you're a bit of a social pariah, right? You kind of get hidden off in a corner, like George was saying. If you have a drink, people aren't going to look at you sideways. But there's cancer risks in both. And I think it was that The Lancet came out saying that there's actually no safe level of drinking. They did this review of studies globally, and there's
no safe level of walking out your front door and not getting hit by a bus.
Of course. It's a calculated risk,
Yes.
of course. But how often when you talk about drinking with your friends do you discuss cancer or the prospect of getting cancer from drinking too much? Or we don't have those conversations. And they're conversations that are well entrenched for cigarettes. We know that you smoke, you get lung cancer, there's a high risk. we don't have those conversations for alcohol. And it's really interesting. And I'm not quite sure why. Maybe you have some insights. Maybe we're in avoidance mode. I'm not sure.
Michael?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. Partly the risks aren't as high. I mean, tobacco still kills more people than alcohol in Australia, but alcohol kills around 5,000 people a year. So it's not a public health problem that we've fixed. And there has been this long conversation about the health benefits of drinking, which are probably true at very low doses, but still very contested. But people don't take all the details of that message in. They see red wine's good for the heart. Like, great, bottle a day, I'll have no problems. And I think
I'll be like Farlap by the end of the week.
Exactly right. I think it muddies the water in a way that people aren't hearing the nuance of the health evidence. I think the risks are much harder. I mean, tobacco is such an easy message. Every cigarette is doing you damage. You smoke, you're going to get lung cancer and die. Alcohol has always been a much more complicated story, and it's harder to communicate in ways that people will understand.
And it's very hard to stick on the label of premium wine what you might look like when
A
they
rotten
cut you
liver
up.
or something, exactly.
Yeah.
Why can't they put on alcohol causes cancer?
I mean,
or
they do-
increases your risk of cancer? Why
They
don't
do in Sweden, for example. A third of the label in Sweden is a big warning. It can be cancer, it can be a bunch of others. They
Yeah.
change it a lot.
Or
So
do
it's
not drink during pregnancy.
It's
at
not
all,
impossible
you know,
to do these things, but we have inquiries about these kinds of policies, and the industry makes very good arguments about why we shouldn't
Yeah.
ruin people's beautiful labels.
I
with
think they're
health
very
warnings.
powerful still.
Have we for too long factored in the cost of drinking as the social cost of our community, in the sense that go to any emergency room on a Saturday night and most of the people there have had something to do with drink on the night. If they've been in an accident or a fight, it's almost inevitable that they will, but we've just sort of rolled that into the overall cost of our health system because drinking has become
That's
so
what
central
surprised
to
me
our
about
culture.
the Sydney lockout laws. I mean, there is this schism that we know that alcohol causes all these harms, but the debate, is like, oh, but I need a drink, and so, okay, well then be honest, accept that it causes all these harms and don't pretend it doesn't, and saying we are willing to put up with, and domestic violence is heavily related to domestic violence too. Are we going to accept that because we want to drink any time? And I think we do kind of accept that. We stopped accepting the road deaths. I mean, the anti-drink driving laws became a big thing. We stopped accepting, oh, well, we're going to have 1,000 people dying in Victoria every year. That became unacceptable. But we're still accepting, I think, the social costs of booze, mostly.
George?
Yeah, can I just... I'm not trying to counter the difficulty of convincing people to do the right thing, but there is one sort of public space where alcohol used to flow freely and it used to be part of the scene, and now it doesn't flow as freely, and most of the drinks that are served are not full strength, and that's at sporting stadiums. So at the football, so I was obviously seen a lot of football games because I started going as a kid. My dad made sure that Mum and I and my sister sat in the dry area next to that little exit at the Putt Road end at the MCG. So if there was a riot, the police on horseback would come to our rescue. That was our first exposure to football in those days. Now, through the 70s and the 80s, even into the 90s, football was, you did take your chances, especially if you went to a suburban ground. That's not the way we conduct ourselves in a public space. But maybe football is the exception to every rule in Australia, because that's the place where everybody wants to project good behaviour. I just wanted to throw that in. So there are big public spaces where getting pissed is not the done thing anymore. But then again, Melbourne Cup is the place where everyone that goes to the Melbourne Cup
Gets this.
and is unlikely to get home in time to throw up, so they have to do it then and there whilst they wait for the cab.
Yes.
So there's still those, the dichotomy there, and the hypocrisy of the campaigns around drinking responsibly, but at the same time, the Spring Racing Carnival, the entire image that it projects, Michael, for young people. I mean, it basically rebuilt the Spring Racing Carnival from the ground up as an enormous 4-day piss-up. That's what it became. I don't think, the horse racing was almost incidental to the consumption of champagne and getting dressed up like you were going to someone's wedding.
Yeah, and it's a kind of a fascinating example of these things that we think are inherent in the event. Like that's just how the Spring Racing Carnival is, but it's a managed brand. It was developed intentionally, and these are the things we think alcohol must be part of are not there by accident. People have worked hard to make those events tied up with alcohol in various ways, and they've worked hard to make the football less. It's part of the image the AFL wants to project is of a family-friendly event.
Yeah.
Like these are things we assume are kind of natural behaviours, like cultural norms that we've established as a population, but industries and organisations have worked to build those things.
Flip, now that you're how far through your year-long... So how many days? You've been counting day by day, almost like you
No.
How many days are you into your experiment without the drink?
Well, it's almost 10 months. I started on January the 1st.
And as you go through, how has it changed you as a person, do you think?
In so many ways for the better. It's actually really irritating, but the rumours are true. I sleep better, my concentration's better, my mental health is better. I've dropped about 10 kilos without even really trying that hard. I'm just generally healthier. I can feel it. And people who haven't seen me for 6 months say, "Oh my God," and they almost fall over sideways, which is really insulting. But I look different to people. They comment on it all the time.
And so is this a lifelong choice for you now?
It's always the question that I get. I don't know. I mean, I never set out to say I will never drink again. But I think it would be a very conscious choice for, I think Gay said the same sort of thing, that you realise how good it is for you not to drink. And so to choose to drink becomes a much more complicated choice because you can feel that it does you harm when you've taken some time off. So I don't know. I don't know. I think at this point I enjoy all the benefits too much I can't quite picture myself being drunk. I can't see that now.
Do you miss it at all? Do you miss it?
Occasionally on Friday nights, if my colleagues have driven me mad, I might really want a drink, but that's very rare these days. And I socialise. The other thing for me, I did not change my social life. Now, some people might not believe me, but I go to dance parties. I still go. There's a whole bunch of sober raves that have sprung up in Sydney, which is really around the whole wellness movement. But they're serving up zero-proof cocktails and you get the whole experience without the alcohol, basically. And they're becoming really popular there as well. And I do everything I ever did, just no booze.
And Gay, is that the same for you? Since you wrote your article, has your relationship with drink fundamentally changed as well?
Well, I'm not as good as Flip. I just took a month off.
Yeah.
And then what I've decided to do is moderate. So I've cut down a lot, particularly during the week. But I know what Flip means, though, that you sort of think, oh, I'm at this point where I'm thinking I probably should give up entirely. I don't really want to because I enjoy on a Saturday night looking at the trees and having a drink. I do enjoy it, but I worry that I'll go back to where I was drinking almost every day. So that goes on in my mind all the time. I just want alcohol out of my head, so I don't have to think about it all the time.
So there was a point where you were thinking about it all the time, was it?
Well, yeah, I was thinking, having a night off was quite a big deal.
Yeah.
And certainly I was having 2 or 3 nights off before I had a month off, but having a month off, you think about it all the time. How am I reacting to this? How am I going to cope with this event? What am I going to do? I'm socialised. What am I going to do if I'm stressed? You think that alcohol makes you less stressed. You think alcohol makes you be able to socialise, and so you have to challenge all those thoughts if you're cutting back. So I'm moderating, but thinking about whether to have a longer period off.
And Sarah, listening to Gay and Flip from their experience and thinking about those older Australians who probably don't identify themselves as having a problem with drinking at all, and I'm not talking about that in the old binary sense, you're either an alcoholic or you're not. Yeah. Is that the key to maybe helping them moderate their drinking? Is being, I hate to use this word because it's such a word about times, mindful about their drinking?
Yeah, I mean, I cringe at it a little as well. But I think it's really important to make that distinction about that sort of old binary of problem or no problem, and instead it's really just a continuum of risk of harm, and the more that you drink, the higher your risk of harm goes. But I think that we're sort of looking into doing some work, and we don't have the results yet, but sort of asking people questions about, do you drink because there's some left, and then do you buy more alcohol because you've run out, and in which case, at which of those points in that cycle are you stopping to think about whether or not you actually want it or you're enjoying it or whatever? Because it might be that some of the consumption that's happening is not actually really being enjoyed or appreciated. It's just being done because that's what you do on that night. And that therefore there might be some ways to reduce people's consumption that doesn't actually take away something that they're enjoying either.
The demographic change in the country itself, George, I know that this is something that fascinates you. Is our drinking, in a sense, in a generation or two going to be fundamentally different because we are going to be fundamentally different just by the makeup of our community?
The more I think about, especially what Sarah was talking about, I think you're going to get two trends in one. And you may get an accentuation and acceleration of a drinking trend as the society ages. So that part of the society as it gets older, and maybe because they've known nothing but affluence, it is so drilled into their sense of being, and especially if they think, you know, you don't get a decent hangover on a decent bottle of wine. You know that old theory that good grog doesn't give you a crappy hangover?
Yes.
Oh, there's lots of them. Vodka didn't give you a hangover.
Yeah,
either.
I've heard all those
times,
things. So actually,
I disproved that one.
this is a very simple way to carve up the country. So at the moment, just over half the country is first or second generation migrant. So we're majority migrant again for the first time since the 1890s. Of course, when we were majority migrant then, we were also piss pots then. So that's, put that one thought to one side. Under the age of 50, you've actually got fewer migrants and more Australian born. That's because all the kids are packed in at the bottom end of it. But the two biggest migrant groups, the two biggest arrivals in the 21st century are the Chinese and Indians. And 80% of the Indians are under 50 and 70% of the Chinese are under 50. And you understand intuitively who they are. They're skilled migrants or students. So I imagine, and if they're part of a global trend to drink less, I think within that part of the Australian population, ethnicity will reinforce, even though you're at the part of the population that has a larger Australian-born population than anywhere else. But the over 50s, and this is the interesting thing about the over 50s, one third of all over 50s are migrants. But their previous waves, you know, Southern European, Southeast Asian, and especially the POMs. Close to 70% of all POMs, English-born, are aged 50 or over. And we know culturally, because we got it from them at the start. You know, the first couple of years, Philip has a ban on grog, but once Philip leaves and the rum corps take over...
The party really starts.
Right? And so culturally, the difficulty as a society ages is you'll probably get, for any number of reasons, a reinforcement of the idea that the thing they've been doing since they started is the thing that's going to continue. Remember, this share of the population is growing relative to all other shares of the population. But our population growth is coming from the overseas migration program. More than half the net addition of the population in Australia is coming from overseas. And the only other time it's happened for a sustained period was in the gold rushes of the 1850s. So you're going to get monumental change at the sort of base of your country, the younger part of your country, but you're going to get a drift into an older part of your country that may be drinking more for years to come. So your public policy challenges are to mix and match your messages depending on what cultural impulses are. And for the life of me, if you're a policy maker, you'd love to be able to bring the sledgehammer down, but your sledgehammer is your end point. Your conversation on the way through to go into sudden death, where you start to escalate the price, because it is price that will affect consumption in the end. That sudden death has to have been, you've had to have a 10-year run-up before you can even get there.
But drinking still is central to our culture. I mean,
But we can do it, but yeah. we can do it and make it a healthy part of our culture. See, this is a WOG prejudice here. So the thing about Aussie culture to Southern Europeans, the thing that always struck us is the strangest thing, and this, again, referencing Very Weird Mob, Australians, and this is my parents' experience in the 60s and 70s, and all their generation have observed this at one point or another. Why don't they eat while they drink, right? It's the whole idea, and this is the 6 o'clock swill was one of the behavioural sort of seeds, that these blokes had finished work and it was going to be gone by 6, so they jug up, go out the door, and then of course they'd bring the violence home, but they didn't drink at home, they drank somewhere else. That's gone now. People obviously eat while they drink, which is not a bad thing. That's probably one step to a sort of a more balanced relationship to alcohol. But as you say, this is the thing that fascinates me about the research. The step down is across the world. So I have to wonder whether the intensification of work and the pressure of being a young person, even before you get to work, is almost the thing that's overriding all other things. Forget the information, forget all the other stuff. There just isn't as much opportunity to drink. So, Francis, remember, without hogging the conversation, remember when we started out as journos, the long lunch?
I totally agree.
That was part of it.
Oh, glory days, George, glory days.
The deadlines would allow you to do it, right?
Yes.
There's You've got a rolling deadline now. You cannot afford to take a drop on work.
And the
because you'll miss
Age
the deadline.
had a bog bar in the men's toilet where people went and drank, which they got rid of quite a few years ago, but then the younger journalists came in and they wanted to go to the gym after work. So it's changed.
That's the thing.
Yes.
That's the thing we ruined.
And just to finish off, something that has fascinated me this entire conversation, Flip, is you as a young person breaking into your parents' liquor cabinet. I think some of us
Probably
will
should
have
have
to
said
admit
that,
to. No, come on. What I want to know to finish before we take questions is, what was your drink of choice when you got in there? What would you mix and make?
Oh my God, it's rocket fuel. So anything.
Whatever you could get your hands on. Do you have a favourite?
Oh God, it would have been, anything blue, green, rum. I don't know. We used to just fill up one of those plastic Coke cups and then take it up to the park. My friends and we'd drink it and then go and get up to no good, basically.
Don't do this at home. All right. Part of the bold thinking experience is to throw the floor open to you to ask questions of our panellists. We do have some microphones available for you to use. So who wants to go first on the floor? We have somebody over here.
Firstly, thanks. That was really interesting. This might be a question for Michael, but I'm not sure. I'm really interested in the rise of alcohol-free drinks, especially beer, like seeing Heineken Zero, Carlton Zero. Is this something that you come across or that you're interested in terms of drinking trends?
Yeah, we're just starting to look at it now, and it's really been less of a thing in Australia than it has been in lots of European countries. We've had a couple of visitors from England come out who are kind of baffled that there isn't non-alcoholic beer in every pub. But it's obviously, partly it's the industry responding to these changes we've been talking about. The industry still wants to sell products. It doesn't really care if the products are strong alcohol or not. It cares that it makes money out of them. And so Heineken, as a profit-making enterprise, is trying to fill this niche in their market that's falling away. If young people aren't going to drink, but they still want to go to pubs, why not produce these products? And for public health, that's great. That's a good outcome. That's less cancer, that's less injury, that's less all kinds of things. So it's one of the rare things that industry can do that we can sort of say, good stuff, keep it up.
Is that, do you think, because still our alcohol consumption is still transactional? We're not drinking for the taste necessarily at that age. We want to get drunk. We're drinking to get drunk. So the point of buying a non-alcohol beer is, why would I do that?
I think so, but also I think it's really helpful for people because you do develop these habits, right? Like I'll go to a gig and the first thing you do is buy a beer. Yeah. And if it's a Heineken Zero, fine. Like it's not really about the alcohol at that point, it's about the ritual. And I think there's that kind of product can help to break the ritual down where you can still go to the pub with your workmates and not have to have a lemon lime bitters, which is sugary, and like you can have a beer and not be getting drunk on Friday night if you want to. So I think there's potential there as a public health intervention.
Can you see that taking off, Gay, as an alternative? You can see a bunch of blokes at a pub ready to watch a rock band drinking non-alcoholic beer.
You probably should ask Flip that because you've been doing it a lot longer and I just have mineral water. But it's a bit of a thing, isn't it?
It's a thing.
And a pressure to have better options.
Seedlip is one option, which looks like...
What's that?
It looks like a bougie gin, but it's actually a zero-proof distilled spirit. And I think Diageo just bought it, actually. I think some of the big booze brands are starting to do exactly what you're saying, which is they're putting out these alcohol-free ranges because they're spotting a trend in the market and they know they're going to lose market share if they don't get on board with it. So you can go and buy a Seedlip and tonic and it costs about $10 and it looks like a gin and tonic, smells like a gin and tonic, but it's completely alcohol-free.
Wow.
Wine
So
is
you get
hard
the
though.
experience. And I think I'd had it one Friday night when I was really grumpy after work and I had two of them with a friend and I felt like I had this weird feeling that I'd just gone out for 2 gin and tonics. That I was
placebo
completely
effect.
sick. Had a complete placebo effect. Yeah, it was really fascinating.
But wake up feeling good in the morning.
Wake up feeling great, yeah.
So, Michael, just quickly, you could tax that at zero.
I mean, it's
Theoretically,
theoretically,
you could incentivise the industry to 5-10% of their...
Yeah, in the 80s, they used to have quite high incentives for very light beer when drink driving laws first really took off. And there was Swan Light, it was called. It was very popular. The tax support disappeared, the product basically disappeared.
I think we've got a question just over the side of the room.
Thanks. I just wanted to touch on that. Like last July, I did Dry July, and I was a drinker for 26 years and have not had a drink since then. And I've gone the total other way. Like I'm actually about to launch a range of non-alcoholic craft beers on the back of that. So probably come January next year, we should hit production and start producing and be on shelf. And like CUB, with their Carlton Zero, they sold 3.2 million litres in the first year for, to be honest, a pretty shit product. But Heineken Zero, like to taste it, you cannot and this has been judged with professional beer judges. They cannot taste the difference in a blind tasting. And like our aim would be to get it on tap into pubs so that you could be with your mates, you could be drinking a 0% and it doesn't look any different. No one knows any different, to try to break down the stigma. Because I think a lot of it is just stigma that's associated with
So
it.
that peer pressure, you think, particularly as someone who's about to enter the market, is still the dominant force among...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, 100%. And I think a lot of it is just, it's habit forming. Like when you've done this for 2 decades or more, like I had, and it's ingrained in people. So we want to try to release something that basically we give young people the chance to not form the habit.
That's Thank you for that insight. That's fascinating, isn't it? What we haven't given people in those generations, people who've grown up drinking, is choice, in the sense that that social setting to have a comparable product or comparable experience, one which doesn't include alcohol. It's always been an outlier. Remember the old Clayton's ads, you know? The Clayton's was the drink you would have when you're not having a drink, but it became, you know, it was derided as a, you know, for fools.
Well, and I think that derision's really important. We actually have a PhD student working at our research centre at the moment, doing his PhD with us at the moment, Chris Cheers, and he's doing work on the stigma that non-drinkers face. And I think that is a real problem, and it might be that some of these non-alcoholic products that look alcoholic might help, because there's certainly a lot of, you know, the barrage of questions and the constant questioning of why you've made that decision is something that people talk about. But also how that they're the police. They are the people who will remember the next day what you did, and so you can't bond with them properly. And that's something that people genuinely say that they're worried about with non-drinkers, and that, you know, and that I don't know if you've been getting that advice from people,
the keeper
or if
of the
they've been hiding
secrets.
that, or no.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think that anything that kind of helps to tear that down, because the idea that people are drinking because they feel like they have to is, you know, when you look at it sort of objectively, is absurd. So yeah.
That must work the other way too. Are you the ultimate designated driver now? Do you get the call from everyone saying, are you going out tonight? Can I come too?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I bet you do. Have we got some more questions from the floor?
Just a question kind of going on that. What about the focus on actually trying to change the culture as opposed to just replacing an alcoholic beer with a non-alcoholic beer?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think culturally it is still the predominant force. And I even say, George, say around your beloved Richmond Tigers, around grand final, the most sacred of Melbourne's, you know, sporting experiences. As soon as the game's over, what becomes the predominant image? It's a player with a Crown Lager in the hand and a premiership medallion around their neck for the next 2 or 3 days.
I read, I think the Age have picked up this story. Dustin Martin left his car at the underground car park at the MCG and still hasn't gone back to collect it because he's now in Vegas.
He's Vegas, yeah.
Yes. In fact, as people, you know, not drunk, poured out, but very, very happy, they headed to Swan. A lot of them headed to Swan Street, where clearly they were going to tear the street apart. Although this time around, the police did step in and say, you can't drink on the street, go back to the pub and continue drinking. But yes, there is this idea. In fact, I would go back to that sort of intensification of work, that the reward at the end of a hard week. That's in a way that's where sport has sort of mirrored the dominant work culture, which is
a hard thirst deserves a big cold beer and all that sort of stuff. Remember?
Yeah, but you can't touch it. You can't touch it while you're performing.
Yeah.
But afterwards you can go nuts, because that's part of the reward for. I mean, I obviously wouldn't necessarily agree that this is the way you should conduct your life, because, you know, pre-season they'll be waiting to see who comes back with the second premiership hangover, and maybe we'll lose to Collingwood again, which would be awful.
Can you see that cultural shift happening across the community, or is it? I mean, there's one aspect we haven't talked about here, which I think is important, is a different class. You know, Australia is still. Some people like to think of it as a classless society. It clearly is not. So in some communities, alcohol is more central to cultural identity. Working class communities, where, you know, drinking at football clubs and drinking after work is still predominant, and it's masculine, and it's generations deep. It certainly is where I grew up. How do we shift that culture, or is it never going to shift?
I mean, you researchers will know better than me, but my understanding is that, unlike, you know, smoking and a lot of other public health problems, the the predominance of heavy drinking is in higher economic groups. Is that true?
It's pretty evenly spread.
Yeah, but it's certainly
a little
not.
bit.
Smoking is much more prevalent in lower socioeconomic groups. So it's a bit different with alcohol. I kind of do perceive the culture, as I said earlier. I don't want to just think because I'm changing my thinking, the whole world is. But the culture in Australia is changing a little. And I do see things like Dry July and Fed fasts and so on really taking off in a big way, and a lot more people, just questioning a bit their drinking in a way they might not have a long time ago, and incredibly heartened by young people not starting it so early. My 20-something-year-old daughter doesn't drink very much, but she does say that she thinks people in her milieu sort of take more ecstasy. But you were saying that those drugs haven't really gone up that much either.
It was big in the 90s too, ecstasy. It hasn't come from nowhere.
I wonder whether you public health people sometimes should concentrate not just on the harms of alcohol, but the benefits of not drinking. You will feel so much better. You will save so much money. The benefits of cutting back alcohol a little bit, rather than just, the harms all the time. Because I do think sometimes people get turned off by you trying to take something away from me that I really enjoy, and I don't think I'm doing it in a risky way.
And I think we've got a growing group to look at now as well, because I think especially in the past, before this particular young cohort came through, such a high proportion of people who were choosing not to drink were doing so because of a reason, so like their health or something else. But I think more and more there's more people to look at that are just actually saying, oh no, it's just not for me.
Yeah,
and
I'm
so
going to take a break. I'm going to cut down.
Yeah,
it's sort of, and the benefits are so good and so obvious for people who do.
It's always been kind of the dream of alcohol policy and public health that we could change the culture somehow. The big liquor licensing review in Victoria in the 80s that opened up, bars and restaurants and pubs everywhere was meant to turn us into Italy or Greece, and for a while it just turned us into uglier, more violent people. But maybe it's who knows what the effect is now. But we don't really know how to. That's the challenge with this current story is young people are drinking less. We don't really know why. It's not something we've done as public health people or as government policy. So I think we'd love to change the culture, but I think it's hard to do deliberately. It happens around you.
Okay.
And so we're reduced to pulling levers like taxation and things because we know how they work.
So you support those levers, big levers, put up prices.
If you want to reduce the 5,000 deaths, that's what you do. That's what we know works. I mean, the culture may be changing and may continue to change, and that's fantastic. But we can help it. I mean, think about drink driving or smoking. The culture changed in parallel with all these legislative changes. You can help it along. You can start to denormalise heavy drinking behaviour the way we denormalised drink driving, which was both culture change and having an RBT around every corner on a Friday night. I think there's kind of a parallel process, and public health knows how to do the kind of ugly lever one, and the culture comes along for the ride, kind of.
And we have another question.
Thank you, Flip, for sharing your story with honesty. I know it's probably not easy to talk about it all the time, but thank you. My question's for Sarah in relation to the harm spectrum. The Global Burden of Disease study, I think it was the 2016 analysis that Flip mentioned that was published in the Lancet. They talk about there being no safe level for drinking alcohol. So it seems to be that there's a spectrum, and I'm just wondering on that harm spectrum whether you can lay dependency over that same spectrum, where dependency fits into that harm.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a different issue. So, I mean, I think it's difficult, and we do often end up sort of measuring it on the basis of the amount of drinks you consume. But, I mean, when you just take into consideration how much, two different individuals could physically consume, then putting even a number on dependency is very difficult. So I think that that the dependency can often get more into, that sort of needs a clinician diagnosis and things like that, whilst the global burden of disease, you can look more at these people said they drank this much and then they got this sick, and so it becomes, it's a really interesting idea, but kind of difficult, I think, unless Michael's got...
I mean, just to say that the risk is not a straight linear increase. The more you drink, the faster your risk goes up. So people at that very pointy end are at much, much higher levels of risk than someone drinking 3 drinks a day or something, and it accelerates the further along you go.
Hi, I'm Kelda. I grew up in Shepparton in the 70s and 80s, back in the day when corporal punishment was still given out to students and things like that, and grew up in a very tough environment surrounded by domestic violence and drinking. And one of the standout memories of my childhood is I didn't ever see it, but the cocking of a rifle and the opening of a tin. That, it's kind of correlate. And I used to see the advertising on TV, and I used to think, why are they advertising? I wish they'd stop advertising alcohol on TV to mitigate the violence. And I'm thinking now, by changing the culture of it is to show what it's really like in all age groups.
Yeah, so that's fascinating because
doing.
we haven't got to the point as we have with cigarettes where we've banned it, and it's still very much associated. I know some major sporting organisations have wrestled with alcohol sponsorship, but they still take it, and it's still that frontier that we're not prepared to cross when it comes to putting alcohol advertising in the sin bin the way that we have with other products which we know do us harm.
Yeah, no, it's you can almost the difficulty I think when in this economic environment to ask people to give up what are revenue streams that are baked into their budgets is tricky. So the football clubs, for example, know that gambling does harm to their members, yet they still take some clubs up to around 20% of their total revenue comes out of gaming.
But some clubs have made the move to have a non-gaming, completely non-gaming revenue stream, so there is a change.
The issue is always, and this is why I referred earlier to long run-ups to a sudden death point, and this is in public policy what you're really aiming to do. In public policy, the end point, you know what your end point is, but most politicians are in a hurry to get there today. So they can announce it and they can be there to cut the ribbon.
And take the credit for that.
So, but most of the public policy challenges in Australia in the 21st century, you think about something like infrastructure, the person who puts the coin in the slot is not going to be the person to cut the ribbon on the congestion busting train line or something. So you are handing over, in a sense, in a public policy sense, to half generation and generations after you to complete the job for you. The way to get the job started is understanding what your endpoint is and working within your culture, knowing which baby steps, which big leaps, which baby steps, which big leaps. And so if the endpoint is banning the advertising, the transitional arrangement may take 10 or 20 years to try and figure out how do you take people out of that particular revenue stream and find another one. And this is why within the industry, if you could find a different way to get your product mix. So you're literally telling the person that you can't advertise on TV anymore. Oh, by the way, if you're advertising this other thing, you're still there. It's a matrix, right?
I understand.
It's very complicated.
Yeah, but as a child,
I absolutely, and I hadn't heard it expressed the gun, the rifle cocking and the thing coming off a tinny. That's quite vivid.
And just listening to you, we joke about alcohol a lot, and we do see it, the public harm for it in accidents and so on, but a lot of it's hidden. I mean, my father had a serious alcohol problem, and I wrote in my piece that I watched my father commit the slow suicide of the middle class slump drunk in front of the TV. A lot of it's hidden.
Yeah.
And my mother, who's dying, says we have 4 children. She has 4 children. She's made one last request to no alcohol at the wake. She said alcohol has been one of the biggest blights on her life, and she hardly drinks at all because her husband, my father, it's had such a big influence on their marriage, and the reason it split up. It's hidden in the suburbs a lot. That pain that you were talking about.
And how like internet memes and things like that, and it's all those things where the Melbourne Cup and seeing the women and the men lying down. It's funny. And that I think that humour needs to be taken out. It just needs to be seen to be sad rather than.
Thank you for your contribution. Just one thing on that is changing. For instance, say within the sporting realm, and this is about cultural change. So, say for instance, Vic Health has a program called Good Sports. So your local football club or cricket club predominantly runs on a budget that's built off traditionally. Have the game, sell food and beer during the game, most suburban sporting clubs, and the revenue generated from the sale of alcohol that on a Thursday night after training on the game day will be what keeps the club alive. So to change that and to change the drinking culture that comes with selling a lot of booze at your games and that being intrinsic to the club, you have to give them a different economic model. So the Good Sports program is designed to teach sports clubs that there is a way to sustainability that doesn't involve the sale of alcohol. And it's been very successful at a number of clubs. That combined with, I think, the growing rise, say, in AFL football in particular, of women's football, In other sports, it's always been there, has fundamentally changed the culture within clubs and has actually built capacity in those communities in a way that it probably never would have done previously, because football clubs were seen to be traditionally a sanctuary for men away from the family home where alcohol was central, and that's no longer the case. So there's a whole new movement within suburban sporting clubs who are trying to understand that there is life without alcohol being the foundation of the survival of their clubs. And that's one way that the cultural change that you're talking about is actually being affected. That's, I think, a very good thing. We've got a question over here as well.
When we are talking about the culture, the question also is whose interests are being served. Is it public as something abstract, or is it interest of the other stakeholders? You just mentioned over here advertising and changing culture regarding, I don't know, sporting clubs. But what about the corporate interests, generally speaking? Because if you are talking about them, it's not only the profit that they are going to say, but also regarding the employment, regarding the hospitality, regarding all of those farmers who have vineyards and all of that. So how are you going to change culture if you are not changing complete economic, political and other social model? And what are you going to replace a current model with?
That's a great question. The economy that is being built around the servicing, the creation, and the consumption of alcohol, where do those jobs come from?
I mean, these changes won't be changes that happen overnight, right?
Yeah.
We've already seen we've dropped consumption by about 10% in the past 5 or 10 years, and economies adjust to these things. I don't think anyone's expecting that alcohol is going to disappear by 2025. I think this is the kind of thing that is gradual through policy and culture change, and that industries and employers and, I mean, jobs move around. The tobacco industry was a big employer. It's not a big employer anymore, and people are still working. I think the economy will move along with these social changes.
Okay. Do we have another? We have a couple of questions down the front.
Thank you. I've got so many things I'd love to ask and to talk about. It's very stimulating. I grew up in a very large Italian community in the 70s and felt like I went to a wedding every week or every month. Someone was getting married and it was the whole big celebration, lots of alcohol. And one thing that stood out was one of my cousins, a cousin who was a Jehovah's Witness. So in amongst all these Catholics was this lone Jehovah's Witness, and they don't drink. So that was always a bit of an oddity to have him around at parties and celebrations. So I was just thinking as you were talking about the influence of faith-based communities that don't drink, that don't have alcohol as the central context of their socialisation, and whether that's ever been looked at as influencing this lowering of, I think of my adult son, he has a lot of Muslim friends, so they don't go out and drink. They go out and have a great time doing other things. So I wondered whether that was ever looked at in terms of religious.
Yeah, we've looked a little bit. Colleagues of mine in Sweden have looked at it there because it's a similar story with their migration patterns. And certainly there's obviously much less drinking in kids from Muslim families, and it doesn't seem like that is the main driver. I mean, the change in the kind of traditional Swedish population has been so marked that it's not possible that immigration has driven all of that. But I think it's hard to measure these things like the friendship group, that suddenly you have friends who don't drink and it becomes more normalised. And those are the kind of like social contagions that are really impossible for us to pick apart, but potentially make this thing, help to drive these trends the way they've been going.
Yeah, so diversity doesn't drive it
solely,
but it has an echo, or has a knock-on effect.
Exactly.
And probably liberate some young people who would prefer not to drink, but feel that they do to fit in if they find themselves in that circumstance, that they don't have to. So it's not a choice they have to make. Now, we might just get that microphone passed along the front here.
Hello. So I was quite struck. I read Gay's piece. I've read Flip's pieces as well. And one of the things that you said was that you had it had a real resonance, particularly with women who are doing the second shift or in the sandwich generation. And we've talked a lot about culture, and I think there's probably cultures of drinking and policy responses to that. And I have in my mind, and maybe you can tell me if the statistical evidence bears this out, but I feel like I've read that it is a growing problem for women in that generation, that women of a certain age with children who are working, they are drinking. That is where you're seeing increased alcohol consumption at home, and that is a culture of drinking that is perhaps becoming increasingly problematic. And I think your piece really resonated because it was both well written and also because you've really put your finger on that, and that's something that I think a lot of people relate to. And it's how do we take that on? And, you know, we've talked about policy responses as well, but do we also need to be looking at what are some of the reasons from in other policy areas that those women are feeling so stressed, and what are some other policy responses that we might do to address some of those stressors in their lives, the second shift, the sandwich generation, and that they wouldn't really feel the need to self-medicate in the way that they are if that is a problem for this generation of women. And if that came, I'm also curious if, Flip, you've had a sort of similar response from women in that demographic to some of the writing that you've been doing as well.
Yeah, I can speak to that first.
Yeah.
I've talked a lot to a GP in Sydney who has, since I've been writing my series, he's been visited by lots of the women that you're describing, mummy drinkers, basically, as we have. They're referred to in popular culture, and I think even if you get on Instagram, you see people hashtag mummy juice. It's a really big cohort of people, and we've heard stories about people, you know, watching the clock until it gets to 5 o'clock, so then it's acceptable to crack a bottle of wine. We're definitely hearing a lot of stories like that. I don't know about the numbers or what the stats are like, but we, after I wrote my stories, the doctor I went to has started to have these women come to him and say, oh, I think I might have an issue. I'm not an alcoholic, but, and he's seeing lots more women like that as well.
Gay?
Yeah. The irony is drinking actually doesn't reduce your stress. I mean, all the evidence sort of shows that it doesn't actually help, but you think it's going to help. And for that, you know, I wrote in my piece, that first half hour, it feels fantastic. You know, it really feels wonderful. All the you know, the problems seem to melt away and you feel a bit euphoric. And I think I wrote, you know, I felt much smarter than normal, and I can handle the world, and, you know, it was brilliant. All this nonsense that goes on in your head for that first half hour. But after that, it's a depressant. It actually makes you feel worse sort of later on. But just to take up your point, because I think it's an interesting one, and I've been reading some history of alcohol. I am aware of, you know, sort of the class issue, certainly going right back, you know, from when the 1700s and gin took over in England and all of that sort of stuff. That's been, people shouldn't drink. It's terribly bad for them. It's terribly, you know, awful, particularly more the upper class people telling more working class people not to drink. Whereas there was one thing I read that said, oh, look, actually, if they didn't have to be working so incredibly hard, and if they weren't so poor they couldn't feed their kids, you know, it's not, drink can be a sort of symptom of other issues rather than just, you know, isn't it terrible that everyone drinks so much, which I think it is. We should reduce our drinking, but it can be a symptom of overweening stress, of needing some support more with the kids, and the sort of the, you know, the moralising about people who drink, particularly in a class way, sort of worries me a little bit. You know, we know best for you, and in Prohibition it was the rich people kept drinking, but the poor people did not. So we do need to look at some of the reasons for that. But look, actually, it doesn't help those problems. Is the irony of it.
But that reminds me, just to finish on a story from my own life about this. So I grew up in Broadmeadows. Now, where I grew up is a housing commission estate. It runs from basically from Pascoe Vale all the way north. It goes a lot longer than it used to now. But my dad used to work as a post sorter in Spencer Street. He didn't have a pub in our neighbourhood. There is not a pub still from Pascoe Vale, the Pascoe Vale Hotel, all the way to Broadmeadows, out to West Meadows. The old hotel is there, but that whole housing commission estate was built in the 60s, 70s and 80s, and there was no licences for pubs. Why was that? Because it was social engineering, because it was determined that working class people couldn't be trusted with pubs, and therefore there is not a pub in that area still to this day, up until 1975, when my dad and his friends built what is called the Broadmeadows Club, which has a liquor licence, but it's a sporting club, which is on the side of a hill in Jacana in Broadmeadows, so that they had somewhere to go and drink. So there's still, to this day, that level of social engineering that goes on. Didn't stop Dad getting on the... My dad, like your father, I stopped drinking about 10 years ago, but, you know, he would get off the train at Pascoe Vale, load up with grog, and then come home late on the train and with half a dozen beers and drink at home. It didn't actually change anything, but the policymakers thought they knew best. But still, if you go out to Broadmeadows, you have to get in the car and go somewhere else if you want to drink. Unlike in Box Hill, where they decided themselves not to drink.
Yes.
But on that note, look, enough from us up here. A couple of upcoming events. We are having a busy finish to the year at La Trobe University, including the Next Fest Festival of Ideas and Events, which is happening on the 24th and 25th of October. So in a couple of weeks' time at the State Library and the Melbourne Spiegel Tent as well in Collingwood, which will be fantastic. A whole range of events that take on some really challenging ideas about our immediate future, about automation, climate change. There's going to be a poetry slam, a body tech conference as well. So check that out on the 24th and 25th. And also Wednesday the 30th of October, the Village Roadshow Theatre at the State Library Victoria. That's right here again. One of interest for those who are interested in industrial relations. Do trade unions help or harm Australia's economy and society? It's a conversation from both sides of the fence. Bill Kelty and Jennifer Westacott will be in conversation with Andrea Carson, and that will be a fascinating discussion. Wednesday the 30th of October, so a couple of weeks away. You can follow all of that on Twitter or on your social channels just using the hashtag BoldL2U. Can you please thank our panel for their contribution tonight? George, Jay, Sarah, Chris and Michael.